anything we do in America is not common sense. It can't be. We're the most obese country in the world with the shortest life expectancy while spending the most money.
The reason our kids are likely going to live shorter lives than we are is because of the obesity epidemic.
In the space of my medical practice, I have watched the tsunami of obesity sweep through the American public. What's happened is that our ever-industrious, creative, imaginative food industry got busy in the laboratories and came up with hyper-palatable foods.
Humans are hardwired to be attracted to fat, sugar, salt for our survival. Manufacturers fuse them into products to create something we call the bliss point, and it becomes very challenging to stop eating, because these flavors mess with our appetite control centers.
When you think about salt, oil, and sugar, they're not actually foods. They're food byproducts that have been concentrated that are added to actual food in order to stimulate dopamine production in our brain. Dopamine is the neurochemical in the brain that induces the response you and I know of as pleasure. The more dopamine, the more pleasure. And so when you add these highly concentrated chemicals to the food, your brain perceives that as a good thing because more is better.
Sugar, fat, and salt work in the same receptors in the brain where opioids work.
Michael Moss interviewed executives from these processed food companies who had retired. And once people retire, they sort of begin to talk. And he recorded them very, very carefully. This is a meticulously researched book that shows how a processed food industry is slowly poisoning an unwitting population. Because people don't really realize that there are dangers attached to these highly processed foods, low in nutritional value, high in calories. So Michael Moss then shows us how the food giants hooked us, how they learned through research how to put the right amount of sugar, the right amount of salt, and the right amount of fat into the products to cause a habituation, if not an addictive pattern. And guess what? Many of these processed food companies were purchased by Philip Morris, which is the tobacco giant. And here's my question. Do you think that Philip Morris has some idea of how to habituate people?
If a person has extra body fat, it's an active chemical factory. Body fat takes hormones that come through it and converts them. For a woman, having too much estrogen can be linked to breast cancer.
One of the molecules that this massive fat releases are called inflammatory cytokines. And these molecules set off inflammation and perpetuate inflammation throughout the body. Biologically, obesity is not a state of health. Obesity is a state of inflammation.
Heart disease and diabetes and prostate cancer and Alzheimer's disease and obesity, all of these chronic diseases share the same underlying biological mechanisms, such as chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in the microbiome, changes in telomeres and gene expression and angiogenesis and so on. And each one of these mechanisms in turn is directly influenced by what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise, and how much love and support we have.
Food is the number one cause of death when it comes to lifestyle factors, more so than smoking, more so than alcohol and drugs.
Dopamine insensitivity also leads to more depression. And when you eat these processed foods and you have dopamine insensitivity, it makes you more likely to become depressed. It used to be 100 years ago, 1 in 100 Americans are mentally ill, and now it's 1 in 5 Americans are mentally ill. And nobody's relating the food supply and sweet consumption and processed foods to this destruction of the human brain, which is occurring right in front of our eyes.
There's a lot of conditions that are conclusively linked to excess body weight. Well, you can talk about the ABCs. A is for arthritis, back pain, and blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, infertility, heart disease, and I could go on and on.
If I'm trying to starve off your weight, you can do that if you got really good resolve, but you can't stay starving forever. And eventually you're gonna rebound, and you're gonna want to eat more food, and you're gonna end up heavier than you were before.
There's this concept called metabolic adaptation. So if you gain a lot of weight over your life and then lose weight, the amount of calories that you need to stay at that new lower body weight is much less than someone else who weighs the same, who's always weighed that same weight for a long time. The ketogenic diet was originally developed for children who had refractory epilepsy, so kids that have seizures. But when you look at the pediatric literature as far as side effects of these diets, the list is incredibly long. So we're talking about everything from kidney stones to bone loss to vitamin and mineral deficiencies, constipation, pancreatitis, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, anemia. So we have a lot of reason to be concerned about these diets. And when you look at the data on low-carb diets overall, people's risk of dying of anything, all-cause mortality, went up about 23%. Their risk of cancer went up 28%. The risk of heart disease went up about 14%. So I can't really get behind a diet that might help people lose some weight in the short term, but has extreme potential long-term consequences.
Our number one killer is cardiac disease, and yet the foods that create cardiac disease are subsidized by the government. That just cannot happen. We have to start subsidizing the foods that make us healthy, not the foods that make us sick.
Unfortunately, there's some authors who will say pretty much anything to sell books, and by telling people what they want to hear, it's a good way to make a bestseller. It just happens to be irresponsible because it's not true.
In medical school, doctors learn what we will get reimbursed for later on. So in medical school, we get about 4 hours or so of actual nutrition education.
I think the real truth is that we've been told a lie for many, many years, and that lie is being perpetuated. There has to be a paradigm shift.
People always try to lose weight by exercising more, eating less, and starving themselves. That's the exact opposite of what you should do.
So a lot of us beat ourselves up because we think, well, it must be us. The problem is us. I'm weak, I'm not strong, I can't do this, I've failed so many times. But if you can relate to that message, then pay attention to this conference.
We don't have to feel ashamed or hide because it's not us, it's the food.
Oftentimes people believe that their DNA is their destiny, that they're destined to be obese. And study after study is continually telling us that our DNA is not our destiny, that when people make dramatic lifestyle changes, that these things play a role in our epigenetics and begin to transform our body from the inside out.
Our genes are a predisposition, but in most cases, our genes are not our fate. And we did a study which we published with Craig Venter, who was the first to actually decode the human genome. And we found in just 3 months, over 500 genes were changed in a beneficial way. Turning on the good genes, turning off the bad genes, turning off the genes that cause weight gain, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and so on.
And the truth is that anyone can do this.
You can't write anybody off. You never know what people have inside of them.
And we're begging you, just make this journey.